And funnily enough, Nick, the bigger vendors, this shit has already happened in the bigger vendors. And we talked about this, I think it was 2 years ago when we started having this conversation, right?
Yeah.
And you've spoken about it so many times. Please take us through what happened with Midnight Blizzard back at the beginning of Jan 2012. It was the end of December, and they told us about it at the beginning of Jan 2024.
So Neil in the chat says fun times not. And I agree with you. And there's this opportunity to mistake what we're doing as unnecessary drama, as opposed to looking at this from a basic hygiene point of view. And just to take the jazz hands drama out of the moment, let's just take a quick step back into the zero trust diagram, and then we'll take a step forward into why this particular hack was so efficient. And it boiled down to basic hygiene. Now, if you remember the zero trust diagram, on the left-hand side, there's identities and devices. And we've been saying for years as an industry that MFA should be non-optional. In other words, you want to embrace MFA like a very basic hygiene principle, very much like how do we brush our teeth after we have a meal, right? Basic hygiene principles. Now, when we consider what we're talking about here from an application governance point of view, it's the same. Because like we know about MFA, it takes one account in a tenant to not be MFA'd, to not be protected with a second factor, to fall victim to a password spray attack. And you can spin up a new tenant, strap a vanity domain, count backwards from 15 minutes, and there'll be a password spray against that. So what does it mean from an application point of view? Similarly, it takes one. And what we're talking about here should be basic hygiene. So let's talk about what happened with Midnight Blizzard. Midnight Blizzard, you had the production tenant, which was Microsoft.com, and you had an adjacent tenant, which was a dev tenant. There was no basic hygiene on that. So literally there was an account because it's just dev, right? And that account was password sprayed and a account was popped. So then an app inside that was discovered, because what do you do when you do any type of a breach? You do basic inventory. Very much like when we start with our cybersecurity journey, you start with basic inventory. The Marie Kondo moment of put everything on the bed and see what you own. So that app had OAuth, well, it wasn't OAuth app, and it had access to Exchange. And the right it had was a rather interesting one, because you'll see it in step 4. Now, that app right there, if you look at full access as app, is not a graph API permission. It's an EWS permission, which meant that these attackers compromised the tenant adjacent to Microsoft, found an application. They built a backdoor over to the Microsoft primary tenant. And then because they had an EWS permission, which is effectively the same permission as mailbox.read.all, they were able to exfiltrate mail from an adjacent tenant that had a relationship with a primary tenant because of basic hygiene, folks. And this is the point that we're making, is that if you park your car and don't lock it, it's a basic hygiene thing, because we know there are people roaming the driveways and the parking lots of our magnificent states and countries where we live, looking to see what has been left unopened. MFA is one of these, and the primary point that we're making tonight is that ungoverned permissions and applications that you've forgotten about is a basic hygiene issue.
Yeah. Look, it's like in the chat, someone said, but what about app ID secrets? Yes. Last month we talked about transitioning from service principals to managed identities, and everything's managed in a better way. But the reality of the situation is that you can't get there tomorrow or the next day or the next day. This is a journey. The term that they use in AI when it comes to ungoverned agents is you need observability, right? It's a big word, observability. And in very much the same way that you need that for this new agentic sprawl that you're getting, and Microsoft's got tooling for that as well, it's exactly the same thing that you're going to need to do when it comes to managing applications. You need observability, and later on in the slides, we actually talk about things that you should be doing when it comes to good app governance. So yes, using a managed identity, cert creds, a few other things, moving away from, app ID type stuff that lives inside of, like a deployment token for a web application inside of Azure. Someone sticks it into their pipeline, the deployment pipeline, and it lives there in a repo.